Especially as we even discussed before, that privacy space is a quickly emerging industry with a lot of opportunities for different talent. So if it's okay, we'll backtrack to kind of the beginning of your career and talk through the different phases a little bit,
Sure.
because you've really done everything from startups to very traditional companies, 150-year-old, to now Google being very much at the forefront of tech. But if we backtrack all the way to your experience working with startups, what are some of the lessons that, or advice that you would give to students and young professionals now thinking about those experiences, things that you wish you had known back then about working with startups?
Yeah, wow, so much. So, startups were extraordinarily fun. I wouldn't do anything differently if I could go back and do it all over again. There is there is so much that I didn't know when I started stumbling into it. Again, this was the first dot-com bubble. This is about 1999. And I don't think many people fully understood the distinction between the sort of the ethereal wealth of stock options and sort of real money. So everyone was taking these strange, hard to value offers with unspecified numbers of options and everything else. And they were leaving salary on the table. And frankly, they were accepting unlivable wages because everybody felt like they were guaranteed some immeasurable wealth at some point in the future because everything was just going to be huge and nothing was going to fail. I learned a lot through all of that. Like, in hindsight, if I kind of compress all of it, the thing that I wish I understood was how little money mattered at the front end. It matters that you can meet all of your responsibilities and all of your obligations and provide to your family, whatever your family situation might be, carry your debts and all that. But making incrementally more money in the first 5-10 years of my career, it just didn't matter in the grand scheme of things. What really mattered was the density of experience, the diversity of experience, kind of amassing a set of skills, abilities, and experiences that were going to make me exponentially more value in the later chapters of my career, when frankly, your capacity to generate value is so much greater than it was at the front end too. I mean, I get that that's antithetical to common knowledge in Silicon Valley, where it seems like everybody has the opportunity to be a trillionaire in your 20s if you just make some really good decisions and you're in the right moment at the right time. But for me, like, looking across the thousands of people I've worked with over the last 20 years in tech and in startups, and extrapolating from those first couple of years, the best advice I think I could give someone, and I give it quite frequently, is don't obsess over incrementally more income at the front end. Like, look at the best opportunity, the most interesting opportunity, and preferably, the work that actually excites you. It sounds like a cliche, but it's so true. If you chase the opportunity that's most interesting, it's probably gonna sort of set you on a journey that's gonna land you in a much better place later on.
The last question I did want to ask you is this interesting space of being able to collaborate with other corporates in this space. Last time when we spoke, you mentioned that there's some really interesting stories from the back end about this whole partnership that Google did with Apple on putting together COVID-19 contact tracing technology. And how do you balance between obviously providing what as a product is serving the public good versus data privacy of its users, and working with even regulators on pulling all of this together? So would love to hear from your perspective how this whole thing took place.
Yeah, wow. So this is probably another 45-minute talk that we could get into at some point in the future. Let me try to abbreviate it as best I can. For those who were not kind of aware of the work, we, at the front end of COVID-19, I was being approached by regulators and lawmakers all over the world who were asking or demanding for access to the sort of hypothetical location data that they assumed that we had because of the Android operating system and the number of phones that it kind of powers around the world. I found myself in a lot of extremely redundant conversations where I had to explain a bunch of things to folks. A, we don't have the data that you think we have because location history is an opt-in feature that a lot of people don't opt into. The data is not super accurate in location history. Will often put you on the wrong side of the road or the wrong floor of the building or something like that, which for contact tracing is dangerous. And contact tracing, that data wouldn't be useful for contact tracing anyway, right? Contact tracing is a well-established over 100-year-old methodology for manually mapping how an infection may have moved across a population. And this data wouldn't really empower that. So trying to explain this to people and still wanting to be helpful, but wanting to not sort of have them wasting cycles trying to sort of work through something that wasn't going to help them solve the problem. Right about that time, several academics inside of Google and outside of Google seem to have a slightly parallel epiphany. They're like, well, wait a minute, what if we used proximity data instead of location data? And sort of lights went on all over the place. There were folks at Stanford that were looking at this. There were folks at MIT that were looking at this. We had internal engineers that were looking at it, and apparently folks at Apple were looking at it. So a bunch of conversations were had as we tried to sort out, is there a there there? Is there a thing to do? It became clear relatively quickly there might be something useful to do with proximity data. Both we and Apple had done different things in that space. And if we put our heads together, we might be able to move farther, faster. And for us to do this, we kind of would have to work together because as the two most common mobile operating systems, you wanted that reach in order to maximize the value. And it wouldn't be for contact tracing. We wouldn't be doing contact tracing. We would be providing a new data set to contact tracers so that they would be able to do their work better. We had a bunch of interesting challenges that we saw sort of even coming out of the gate. One was we had a technical problem. Nobody had ever tried to bend the low energy Bluetooth signals to do this thing. Can you really tell if someone's 3 feet versus 9 feet versus 15 feet away? People hadn't really figured all these things out before. We didn't know about signal fidelity. We didn't know about error rates. It just wasn't as important in the past. So engineers had to kind of start collaborating and sorting that bit out. Then we had a general public policy problem that we needed to sort, which was there were different ideas about the right way to do this. Some public health authorities and some academics and government agencies thought you should create a centralized registry that's run by the government. All of the phones should feed data back up into that registry and everyone should trust their government to do the right thing with it. And that was going to deliver the best outcome. Others, including ourselves, were nervous about that in that it would be very hard to prevent abuse or repurposing of that data set later on for things that we didn't think were appropriate and that we didn't necessarily want to be building a surveillance architecture that could be repurposed later on. So we needed to have that debate. We weren't sure that we were going to be able to have it successfully because we're dealing with sovereign states that have a right to do stuff that we don't get to tell them not to do sometimes. And then the last thing was there was going to be an adoption problem, right? In that even if we got steps 1 and 2 right, we built the best technology in the world, we got regulators on board. If users didn't trust it, then we wouldn't get sufficient adoption and the thing wouldn't be used, wouldn't actually be able to materially advance the public health problem that we were trying to assist with. So, well, and there was another bit to that last bit, which was nobody knew that this was actually going to help, right? Like that we were presuming that maybe this data would be useful in assisting public health authorities and contact tracers to do the thing that they needed to do anyway, better, faster, at a bigger scale. But we might have been wrong, right? And if we were wrong, that could have been disastrous. We wanted to be careful that we weren't causing all of these folks to waste resources focusing on our sort of technical wizardry, if in fact they should have been devoting all of those resources just directly to traditional contact tracing. So huge, complicated global problem with the potential to save lives if we got it right. Doesn't get more serious than that. And this unique opportunity where sort of our frenemies over at Apple we were looking at each other. Fortunately, we had some great history. Jane Horvath, who's the chief privacy officer at Apple, was my colleague at Google before she went over to Apple. So, and one of the lead lawyers on her team had recently joined Apple from our team over at Google. So there were synergies there. There were trust relationships that made a lot of it work really well. There's always been massive engineering respect between the Apple teams and the Google teams as well. So there was almost an eagerness, I think, at the tech level to work together because they don't frequently get the opportunity to do that. And then our leaders were inspiring, right? Like I will always remember Sundar saying, I understand the risks and I understand this is not necessarily in our business best interest, right? Like there is no business play. Someone could argue there's a reputational benefit here, maybe, but probably not if we get it wrong, right? Like it could totally bank the other way. And this could be a disaster if it goes wrong. But Sundar and the leadership team were like, it's the right thing to do, right? And no one else can do it but us. That was like the interesting variable, to hear them recognize no one else could do this but Google and Apple at that moment in history. And they gave us free reign. So me and a small handful of other people were tagged with being a bit of a SEAL team to begin exploring this. And then that ballooned into this massive effort across Apple and across Google. We worked together. It was exhausting and fun and challenging. And we learned a ton. So one of the sort of the immediate learnings that came out of all of it, we collaboratively felt sort of bizarre showing up with regulators, with our competitor alongside, who is frequently criticizing us in other contexts. And then we find ourselves advocating for the same thing and advocating for this privacy first approach. One of the big design principles that we anchored on was we were not going to do a centralized database. We were going to maximize processing on the phone. We were going to make it maximally private. Some folks were critical of that because they were afraid we were over rotating towards privacy, possibly hurting efficacy. That was the big learning. After all of it, that was the big takeaway from my discipline, which was there was a presumption that if you optimized for privacy, it was at the cost of efficacy. That was the headwind we had to get through, and it took us months. But what we learned, and what I think all of the folks on all sides of the conversation that were really actively in the weeds with us on it learned, was that was an erroneous presumption. Optimizing for privacy had no demonstrable efficacy cost at all. And in fact, if you think about those sort of 3 stages of challenge I outlined at the beginning, they were massively beneficial, because maximizing for privacy dramatically improved adoption rates and improved the probability that we were ever going to get this thing voluntarily installed on users' devices, and without which it would have failed anyway. So even if we had built something that was 5% more effective, if it was potentially at risk of becoming a surveillance tool, people wouldn't have installed it, and it would have been useless and just sort of gone into the annals of history as a failed effort at corporate collaboration. So yeah, we learned a ton. We could talk a whole lot more about it, but in broad strokes, that's what that adventure was all about.